At 35,000 feet, Pacific Crown Flight 521 hummed with the steady rhythm of routine. In Seat 9F, wedged between a restless businessman and a window streaked with dawn light, sat a woman nobody noticed. Juliana Mercer wore faded jeans, a plain gray sweatshirt, and the kind of invisible armor that came from years of practice. She was just another passenger, just another face in a cabin full of strangers headed to Hong Kong. But in less than 2 hours, when both pilots collapsed and 273 lives hung in the balance, this forgotten woman in Seat 9F would remember who she used to be, and the sky would remember her name. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The Boeing 777 had departed Seattle-Tacoma International Airport at 6:47 a.m., climbing through layers of Pacific Northwest cloud cover before breaking into brilliant morning sunlight. Inside the cabin, the usual symphony of air travel played out in familiar patterns. Seatbelts fastened with metallic snaps. Air attendants moved through the aisles with practiced efficiency, their smiles professional and their movements choreographed by thousands of hours of repetition. Juliana sat perfectly still in her middle seat, a paperback novel open in her lap that she hadn't turned a page of in 20 minutes. Her eyes tracked the words without reading them, a trick she'd perfected over the past 6 years. Looking busy kept people from starting conversations. Looking occupied meant nobody asked questions. And questions were dangerous when you'd spent half a decade building a life designed to be forgettable. To her left, Gerard Holt typed furiously on his laptop, his expensive suit rumpled from the early departure, his cologne strong enough to make her eyes water. He'd already complained twice about the legroom, once about the Wi-Fi speed, and had made a point of letting everyone within earshot know he was flying business class on the return trip. To her right, the window seat remained mercifully empty, giving her just enough space to exist without intrusion. In row 12, a teenage girl named Sophie Winters sat with her mother, earbuds in, sketching something in a worn notebook balanced on her tray table. Sophie had the kind of restless energy that came with being 16 and convinced the world was both too big and too small at the same time. She'd glanced at Juliana twice during boarding. Something in the older woman's posture triggered a curiosity she couldn't name. 3 rows ahead, Dr. Isaac Patel settled into his seat with the weary contentment of someone heading home after a long medical conference. His badge still hung from his jacket pocket, identifying him as a trauma surgeon from Vancouver General Hospital. He'd seen enough emergencies in his 20-year career to recognize the particular stillness of people who'd learn to stay calm when everything around them fell apart. Flight attendant Brianna Velasco moved through the cabin with the efficiency of someone who'd worked for Pacific Crown Airlines for 12 years. She had sharp eyes, a warmer smile than most in her profession managed to maintain, and an instinct for reading passengers that bordered on supernatural. As she passed row 9, something about the woman in Seat F made her pause just for a fraction of a second. The passenger sat too straight, breathed too controlled, held herself with a discipline that didn't match the casual clothes or the deliberately unremarkable appearance. But the moment passed. Brianna had 273 passengers to manage, a 12-hour flight ahead, and a new first officer she had never worked with before. Whatever story the woman in 9F was carrying, it wasn't her job to uncover it. Up in the cockpit, Captain Douglas Sinclair ran through post-takeoff checks with the methodical precision of a man who'd logged over 15,000 flight hours. At 52, he was one of Pacific Crown's most senior pilots, known for smooth landings and an almost obsessive attention to protocol. His co-pilot, First Officer Whitney Carver, was 31 and brilliant, with a reputation for systems mastery that had fast-tracked her through the ranks. "Beautiful morning for flying," Whitney said, adjusting her headset as they leveled off at cruising altitude. Douglas nodded, his eyes scanning the instrument panel with the kind of automatic awareness that came from 3 decades in the cockpit. Clear skies all the way to Anchorage, should be a quiet ride. Neither of them knew that in exactly 93 minutes, both of them would be unconscious on the cockpit floor. Neither of them could have predicted that the fate of everyone on board would rest in the hands of a woman in a middle seat who hadn't touched aircraft controls in 6 years. Juliana Mercer hadn't always been invisible. Once, she'd been called Hawk. Once, her call sign had been spoken with the kind of respect reserved for pilots who could dance through impossible situations and make it look effortless. Once, she'd worn a flight suit with her name stitched above the heart and wings pinned to her chest that meant something more than metal and thread. But that was before Afghanistan, before the convoy ambush that she'd saved by breaking every rule in the book, before Colonel Warren Sinclair had rewritten her heroism as recklessness and buried her career under carefully constructed lies, before she'd lost her wings, her reputation, and everything she'd worked 20 years to build. Now, she lived in a studio apartment in Tacoma, working 3 part-time jobs that never required her to explain the 7-year gap in her resume. She filed papers at a legal office. She shelved books at the library. She delivered packages on weekends. None of her coworkers knew she'd once flown F-16s in combat zones. None of them knew that Hawk had once been a legend among fighter pilots, whispered about with admiration in ready rooms across 3 continents. She'd let it all go, not because she'd wanted to, but because someone had needed her more than her pride. Her brother's medical bills after the car accident, her niece's college fund when her brother couldn't work. The choice between fighting to clear her name and keeping her family afloat had been brutally simple. So she'd chosen invisibility, chosen silence, chosen to let the world forget who Juliana Mercer had been, because that was easier than fighting a system designed to erase people who didn't play by unwritten rules. The flight attendant's voice crackled over the intercom, pulling Juliana back to the present. Ladies and gentlemen, we've reached our cruising altitude of 35,000 feet. Feel free to move about the cabin, and our crew will be coming through shortly with beverages. Juliana closed her book and tucked it into the seat pocket. She'd memorized every emergency exit, every piece of safety equipment, and the basic layout of the Boeing 777 within the first 5 minutes of boarding. Old habits died hard, even when you were trying to forget who you used to be. Beside her, Gerard Holt flagged down Ethan Kruger, the male flight attendant working their section. Coffee, black, and make sure it's actually hot this time. Ethan's smile never wavered. Of course, sir, right away. Juliana accepted water when he returned, noting the slight tightness around Ethan's eyes that came from dealing with difficult passengers while maintaining professional courtesy. She'd worked enough service jobs in the past 6 years to recognize the particular exhaustion of being treated as invisible labor. Thank you, she said quietly, and meant it. Ethan's expression softened slightly. You're welcome. Let me know if you need anything else. The minutes ticked by. The cabin settled into the drowsy rhythm of long-haul flight. Some passengers watched movies on seat-back screens. Others slept, heads tilted at uncomfortable angles against window shades. A baby cried somewhere in the rear of the cabin, the sound rising and falling like a distant siren. Juliana sat in her middle seat and watched the world float by at 500 miles per hour. She'd stopped dreaming about flying years ago, stopped waking up with her hands moving through phantom pre-flight checks, stopped hearing the particular music of engines spooling up for takeoff. She'd become exactly what she'd needed to become. Nobody. Nothing. Just another passenger in just another seat on just another flight. But 35,000 feet above the Pacific Ocean, with 273 souls sharing the sky, fate was about to remind Juliana of something she tried so hard to forget. Some people are born to fly. And when the world needs saving,
Legends don't stay buried. They just wait for the moment when nobody else can answer the call. That moment was coming. In exactly 78 minutes, both pilots would collapse, and the woman in seat 9F would have to remember who she really was, whether she wanted to or not.
The memory always came back the same way. Not gradually, not gently, but like a fist to the chest when Juliana least expected it. Afghanistan. 7 years ago. The Hindu Kush Mountains rising like broken teeth against an impossibly blue sky. Her F-16 slicing through thin air at Angels 20, providing overwatch for a convoy moving through the Korangal Valley. The radio chatter had been routine until it wasn't, until the voices turned sharp with panic, and the word ambush crackled through her headset like electricity. Juliana had been flying high cover that day, designated as Quick Reaction Force Backup. Protocol said to maintain altitude. Protocol said to wait for ground commander authorization. Protocol said a lot of things that made perfect sense right up until the moment you watched friendly forces getting torn apart by coordinated enemy fire from 3 sides. She'd made the choice in less than 2 seconds. Pushed the stick forward, dove into the valley, ignored the voice of her squadron commander ordering her to maintain position. She'd seen the convoy pinned down, seen the RPG teams repositioning for kill shots, seen the window of opportunity closing faster than thought. What she'd done next became legend in some circles and career suicide in others. 3 strafing runs at altitudes that violated every safety protocol ever written. Precision cannon fire that eliminated enemy positions with surgical accuracy. A final pass that drew fire away from the convoy long enough for reinforcements to arrive. She'd taken hits, lost hydraulics, nursed a dying aircraft back to base on backup systems, and pure stubbornness. 23 soldiers had walked away from that ambush. 23 human beings who'd gone home to families, who'd lived to see another day, who existed because one pilot had chosen lives over protocol. The Medal of Honor had been in the paperwork. Her squadron had put her in for every commendation that existed. The pilots she'd saved had written testimony that should have secured her place in aviation history. Then, Colonel Warren Sinclair had gotten involved. Sinclair was a political creature who'd climbed the ranks through connections rather than competence. He'd never seen real combat, never made a decision where seconds meant the difference between life and death. But he understood optics. He understood how dangerous it was when junior officers became more respected than their commanders. And he understood that Juliana's heroism made his own mediocrity uncomfortably visible. The investigation had been swift and surgical. Witnesses were interviewed privately, radio transcripts were edited, medical evaluations were ordered that questioned Juliana's mental stability. The questions were designed to create doubt, to make her second-guess every decision, to transform confidence into something that looked like instability when written down by people who'd never flown into fire. The worst part wasn't the lies. The worst part was watching people she'd trusted, people she'd served alongside, choose career preservation over truth. One by one, they'd adjusted their statements, softened their support, found reasons to remember things differently than they happened. The final report was a masterpiece of bureaucratic assassination. Juliana Mercer was deemed psychologically unfit for combat operations, recommended for immediate grounding, suggested for psychiatric evaluation, and possible medical discharge. Her actions in Afghanistan, rather than being commendable, were evidence of poor judgment and inability to follow lawful orders during high-stress situations. She'd tried to fight it, hired a lawyer she couldn't afford, gathered statements from the soldiers she'd saved, prepared for a hearing that would expose every lie Sinclair had constructed. And then her brother's accident happened. The car crash that left him paralyzed. The medical bills that insurance wouldn't cover. The rehabilitation costs that multiplied faster than hope. Juliana had looked at the numbers, looked at her niece, who was 12 and brilliant and deserved a chance at college, looked at her brother, who'd raised her after their parents died and never once asked for anything in return. Then she'd looked at the fight ahead of her and done the math that had nothing to do with money. Fighting to clear her name meant years of legal battles, meant media attention that would destroy what was left of her family's privacy, meant her brother's medical needs taking a back seat to her ego, meant watching her niece's future evaporate while Juliana fought a war she might not win. So, she'd walked away, accepted a general discharge under medical conditions, signed papers that said she wouldn't disparage the Air Force or discuss the circumstances of her separation, took the small disability check that barely covered rent, and found work that didn't require explanations. She'd watched from a distance as Warren Sinclair got promoted, watched him give speeches about leadership and integrity, watched him become the face of modern military aviation while systematically destroying anyone who threatened his carefully constructed image. The fighter-pilot community knew the truth. In ready rooms and bars and quiet conversations, Hawk was still spoken with reverence. But whispered respect didn't pay medical bills, didn't fund college educations, didn't matter when you were choosing between pride and family. Juliana had chosen family, every single time. And she'd done it without regret, even when it hollowed her out from the inside, even when she couldn't look at airplanes without feeling like she had amputated part of herself, even when she woke up at 3 a.m. with her hands moving through pre-flight checks for aircraft she'd never fly again. 6 years. That's how long she'd been nobody. 6 years of studio apartments and part-time jobs and teaching herself not to look up every time a jet crossed the sky. 6 years of burying Hawk so deep that sometimes she almost believed the woman in the flight suit had been someone else entirely. She built a life that worked. Small, quiet, forgettable. Her brother was walking again. Slowly, but walking. Her niece was in her second year at a good university, studying engineering. The bills were paid. The family was intact. That had to be enough because it was all she had left. But you can't kill who you are. You can bury it, ignore it, pretend it doesn't exist, but the core of a person, the fundamental truth of what they're capable of, doesn't disappear just because it's inconvenient. It waits. Patient and quiet and inevitable. On Pacific Crown Flight 521, cruising at 35,000 feet with 273 souls on board, Juliana Mercer's past was about to demand payment on a debt she didn't know she owed. Because sometimes the universe doesn't care about the life you've built. Sometimes it looks at who you really are and decides that comfortable obscurity is a luxury the world can't afford. And sometimes, whether you want to or not, you have to remember that some people are born to fly. And when the sky calls your name, silence is no longer an option. The first sign that something was wrong came at 9:47 a.m., exactly 2 hours and 13 minutes into the flight. Brianna Velasco was in the galley preparing the lunch service when she heard the call button from the cockpit. 3 short chimes. The signal that meant the pilots needed something, usually just coffee or a bathroom break. Routine. Unremarkable. She grabbed 2 bottles of water and headed forward, balancing them on a small tray with the practiced grace of someone who could walk steady through turbulence that would send passengers reaching for sick bags. She knocked twice on the cockpit door, waited for the security camera confirmation, then entered when she heard the lock disengage. What she saw made her stop so suddenly that water sloshed over the rim of one bottle. Captain Douglas Sinclair was slumped in his seat, one hand clutching his stomach, his face the color of old newspaper. Beside him, First Officer Whitney Carver looked even worse, her skin slick with sweat, her breathing shallow and rapid. "Something's wrong," Douglas managed, his voice tight with pain. "Both of us started about 10 minutes ago."
Whitney tried to speak but instead lurched forward, barely getting her hand over her mouth in time. The acrid smell of vomit filled the confined space, mixing with the sterile air and the underlying scent of jet fuel that permeated every aircraft. Brianna's training kicked in before her panic could. "What did you eat?" "Crew meal. The chicken." Both pilots. The same meal. The implications crystallized in Brianna's mind with terrifying clarity. This wasn't just food poisoning. This was a catastrophic failure of the one redundancy that was supposed to prevent exactly this scenario. Pilots were supposed to eat different meals for precisely this reason, but budget cuts and staffing shortages had led to compromises that looked fine on paper until they weren't. "I need to get medical help," Brianna said, forcing her voice to stay calm even as her heart hammered against her ribs. "Can you maintain control?" Douglas nodded, but even that small movement seemed to cost him. His hands trembled on the controls, and the aircraft's heading began to drift slightly to the left before he corrected with visible effort. "Autopilot's engaged," Whitney whispered, her eyes squeezed shut. "But if we need manual control—" She didn't finish the sentence. Didn't need to. Brianna backed out of the cockpit, her mind racing. She found Ethan near row 15 helping an elderly passenger stow a bag. "Medical emergency," she said quietly, pulling him aside. "Both pilots. Food poisoning. Bad. We need any medical doctors on board now." Ethan's eyes widened, but to his credit, he didn't panic. "I'll make the announcement. You check the cockpit again." The PA system crackled to life. "Ladies and gentlemen, if there are any medical professionals on board, please identify yourselves to the flight crew immediately. We have a medical situation that requires assistance." In the cabin, heads turned, murmurs rippled through the rows. Dr. Isak Patel was already unbuckling his seatbelt, moving forward before Ethan could reach him. "I'm a trauma surgeon," he said quietly. "What's happening?" "Both pilots," Brianna said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Food poisoning. Bad." Isaac's expression went very still in the way that medical professionals learn when they're processing information they wish they weren't hearing. "Show me." In the cockpit, the situation had deteriorated. Douglas was now hunched over completely, dry heaving into a bag that Brianna had left. Whitney had her head between her knees, trying to fight off waves of nausea and dizziness that made the instrument panel swim in her vision. Isaac examined them both with swift efficiency, checking pupils, pulse, skin temperature. When he emerged 2 minutes later, his face told Brianna everything she needed to know before he spoke.
"Severe food poisoning, possibly salmonella. They're both going into shock. Dehydration, fever, possible sepsis developing. They need immediate medical attention." He paused, and Brianna saw him calculating odds he clearly didn't like. "They can't fly this aircraft. Not now. Probably not for hours. Maybe not at all until we get them to a hospital." The words hung in the recycled air of the cabin like a death sentence. Brianna felt the world tilt sideways in a way that had nothing to do with the aircraft's attitude. "We need to contact air traffic control. Declare an emergency." Back in the main cabin, the announcement had created a ripple effect of awareness that something was seriously wrong. Passengers who'd been dozing woke up. Others stopped their movies, removed their headphones, leaned into the aisles trying to see what was happening at the front of the plane. Gerard Holt in seat 9E had already flagged down Ethan. "What's going on? Why do you need doctors?" "Sir, please return to your seat. I paid for this ticket, and I have a right to know if there's a problem with this flight." Sophie Winters, 3 rows back, had pulled out her earbuds and was watching the flight attendants move with increasing urgency between the galley and the cockpit. Something in their body language screamed crisis, even if their faces tried to maintain professional calm. Juliana sat perfectly still in seat 9F, her book closed in her lap, her eyes tracking every movement of the crew with the kind of attention that comes from years of training. She had counted the trips to the cockpit, noted the barely concealed panic in Brianna's eyes when she had emerged the second time, watched the doctor disappear behind the cockpit door with the grim expression of someone delivering bad news. She knew what was happening before the announcement came, had known from the moment she saw Brianna's face, had felt it in the subtle change in the aircraft's handling. the slight delay in corrections that meant whoever was at the controls wasn't operating at full capacity. The PA system crackled again. This time, Brianna's voice carried an edge that cut through every conversation in the cabin. "Ladies and gentlemen, we are experiencing a medical emergency with our flight crew. We are declaring an emergency and will be diverting to the nearest suitable airport. Please remain calm and in your seats. We will provide more information as it becomes available." The pause that followed was the sound of 273 people simultaneously realizing that something was terribly, fundamentally wrong. Then someone in first class said, loud enough to carry, "Wait, if the pilots are sick, who's flying the plane?" The question triggered exactly the response that Brianna was trying to prevent. Panic spread like wildfire through dry grass. Voices rose. Someone screamed. A man in row 22 started praying loudly in a language Juliana didn't recognize. Gerard Holt stood up despite Ethan's attempts to get him seated. "This is unacceptable. I demand to speak to whoever's in charge." In the cockpit, Douglas Sinclair finally lost his battle with consciousness, slumping sideways in his seat. Whitney tried to reach for the controls, but her hands wouldn't obey properly, her vision tunneling into darkness at the edges. The autopilot held steady, but autopilot couldn't land an aircraft. Autopilot couldn't handle emergencies. Autopilot was a tool, not a replacement for human judgment and skill. And at 35,000 feet, with 2 pilots incapacitated and 273 souls on board, Pacific Crown Flight 521 desperately needed someone who could do what machines couldn't. Someone who could fly.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. Juliana Mercer had made a career out of staying invisible. 6 years of training herself to blend into backgrounds, to become forgettable, to exist without drawing attention. But there are moments when invisibility becomes impossible, when the calculus of self-preservation collides with the mathematics of necessity, and silence transforms from safety into complicity. This was that moment. She unbuckled her seatbelt with hands that were perfectly steady, stood up with the kind of controlled movement that drew eyes without meaning to, and stepped into the aisle. Around her, chaos continued to build. A woman in row 11 was hyperventilating into a paper bag. 2 businessmen were arguing loudly about lawsuits. Gerard Holt was still standing, his voice rising above the others as he demanded answers nobody could provide. Juliana moved forward through the turbulence of human panic with the same calm she'd once carried into combat zones. Each step deliberate, each breath measured. The woman who'd spent 6 years pouring coffee and shelving books was gone, replaced by something harder, something that had been waiting patiently for the moment when it would be needed again. Brianna saw her coming and moved to intercept. "Ma'am, please return to your seat. We need everyone." "I can fly this aircraft," Juliana said quietly. 4 words. Simple. Implausible. True. Brianna stopped mid-sentence, her professional mask cracking just enough to show the desperation underneath. "Excuse me? I'm a pilot. 15 years military aviation, 3,000 hours in tactical aircraft, qualified on multiple platforms, including commercial simulators." Juliana's voice carried the particular tone of someone stating facts, not making requests. "I can land this plane." For a moment, Brianna just stared at her. This woman in faded jeans and a gray sweatshirt. This passenger who'd been so quiet, so unremarkable. This person who was now claiming to be the answer to a prayer Brianna hadn't even had time to formulate. "Do you have any identification, any proof of—" "Not on me. But you can verify through air traffic control. My name is Juliana Mercer, former Air Force, call sign Hawk." She paused, then added the detail that mattered. "I can save everyone on this plane, but we don't have time for bureaucracy." Gerard Holt had heard enough of the conversation to insert himself. "Absolutely not. You want to let some random passenger into the cockpit during an emergency? This is insane. Sir, please." "No.
Gerard's voice carried through the cabin, drawing more attention. I've flown business class on 3 continents. I know protocols. You can't just let anyone who claims to be a pilot take control of a commercial aircraft. We need to contact the airline, get proper authorization, follow procedure. Juliana turned to face him, and something in her expression made Gerard take an involuntary step backward. In approximately 4 minutes, this aircraft will need to begin descent procedures to reach Anchorage while we still have fuel margins. In 6 minutes, we'll be past optimal glide range if the engines fail. In 8 minutes, autopilot limitations will require manual input for weather avoidance. Which procedure do you want to follow while we wait for authorization that won't come in time? The specificity of her answer cut through some of Gerard's bluster, but not all of it. The Boeing 777 has a wingspan of 199 feet 11 inches, maximum takeoff weight 660,000 pounds, landing speed approximately 160 knots depending on weight and configuration, approach angle 3 degrees. This particular variant uses Rolls-Royce Trent 800 engines, generating 74,600 pounds of thrust each. The cockpit has 6 LCD displays: primary flight display, navigation display, engine indication and crew alerting system. I can walk you through every switch, every circuit breaker, every emergency procedure in the quick reference handbook. Or we can waste time debating while people die. Dr. Isaac Patel had emerged from the cockpit, and he had heard the last part of the exchange. He said bluntly, "The pilots are unconscious, both of them. They're not waking up anytime soon, and we need someone in that cockpit who knows what they're doing, and we need them now."
Brianna made a decision that would either save lives or end her career, possibly both. "Come with me." But Gerard wasn't finished. He grabbed Juliana's arm as she moved to follow Brianna. "I'm not letting you endanger everyone on this plane because you have some kind of hero fantasy. We should wait for professional help. The airline can talk someone through the landing remotely, or—" Juliana looked down at his hand on her arm, then back up at his face. "Remove your hand." Something in her tone made Gerard comply, but he wasn't backing down. "You're going to get us all killed." Sophie Winters had been listening from row 12, her sketch forgotten, her heart pounding. There was something about the woman from 9F, something in the way she stood, the way she spoke, that reminded Sophie of documentary footage she'd watched about fighter pilots. That particular combination of calm competence and absolute certainty that came from people who'd learned to function when functioning was the difference between life and death. "Let her try," Sophie said, her young voice cutting through the adult arguments. "What's the alternative?" "The alternative," Juliana said, still looking at Gerard, "is that everyone on this aircraft dies when we run out of altitude, fuel, or luck, in that order. Your choice is simple. Trust someone who knows what they're doing, or trust that hope and procedure will defy physics." Other passengers were weighing in now, some supporting Juliana, others siding with Gerard. Most just scared and looking for any option that felt like control in a situation spiraling beyond anyone's grasp. Brianna made the call. "We're going to contact air traffic control. They'll verify your credentials. If they confirmed you're who you say you are, you're getting in that cockpit." Juliana nodded. "Make the call, but make it fast. Every second we waste is fuel we'll need later." As Brianna moved to the communication panel, Ethan appeared at her elbow. "Are we really doing this?" he whispered. "Do we have a choice?" Brianna replied, her hands already moving through the emergency communication protocols. In the cockpit, both pilots lay unconscious, their breathing shallow, their bodies fighting an infection that had hit fast and hard. The autopilot held the aircraft steady at 35,000 feet, maintaining heading and altitude with mechanical precision. But autopilot couldn't make decisions, couldn't handle emergencies, couldn't land the plane. The radio crackled to life. "Pacific Crown 521, this is Seattle Center. We copy your emergency. Confirm both pilots incapacitated and you're requesting guidance for passenger-assisted landing." Brianna's hand shook slightly as she pressed the transmit button. "Seattle Center, affirmative. We have a passenger claiming military aviation experience. Name Juliana Mercer, call sign Hawk. Can you verify credentials?" The pause that followed felt like years compressed into seconds. In the cabin, 273 people held their collective breath. Gerard Holt stood with his arms crossed, certain that this would expose the woman as a fraud. Sophie Winters gripped her mother's hand, hoping against hope that the calm woman from 9F was exactly who she claimed to be. Then the radio spoke again, and everything changed. Pacific Crown 521, this is Anchorage Approach Control. Director Leonard Ashford. Confirm you have Juliana Mercer on board, former Air Force, call sign Hawk. Brianna looked at Juliana, who nodded. Affirmative, Anchorage, she's here. Another pause. Then Leonard's voice came back, and there was something in his tone that made Brianna's eyes widen. Something like recognition, something like respect. Put her on the radio. Hawk and I need to talk.
Juliana took the headset from Brianna's hand, the weight of it familiar despite 6 years of absence. She pressed the transmit button, and when she spoke, her voice carried the particular cadence of someone who'd logged thousands of hours on military frequencies. Precise, professional, zero wasted words. Anchorage approach, this is Hawk. Go ahead. The silence that followed lasted exactly 3 seconds. In the cabin, passengers leaned forward, trying to hear. Gerard Holt stood with his arms crossed, still convinced this was about to unravel. Sophie Winters held her breath. Then, Leonard Ashford's voice came through the speakers, and it carried something that made Brianna's skepticism begin to crack. Not just recognition, but the kind of respect reserved for people who'd earned their reputation in fire and blood. Hawk, Leonard Ashford. I was air traffic control at Bagram in 2018. I was in the tower the night you brought that damaged F-16 home through a sandstorm with no hydraulics and half your instruments dead. Talked you down on backup systems while you flew manual reversion for 43 minutes. Juliana's expression didn't change, but something in her eyes flickered. A memory of burning through the dark Afghan sky with warning lights painting the cockpit red. Leonard's voice, the only constant thing in a universe trying to kill her. I remember, she said simply. Then you remember that I know exactly what you're capable of. And these people need that capability right now. Leonard paused, and when he continued, his voice had shifted from recognition to command. Status report. Both pilots down? Affirmative. Food poisoning, both unconscious. Doctor on board says they're not flying anytime soon. Aircraft is stable on autopilot, 35,000 feet, currently heading 320. Copy. How current are you on Boeing 777 systems? Sim training 3 years ago for potential commercial transition, never flew the actual aircraft, but I'm familiar with flight deck layout, automation architecture, and basic systems management. In the cabin, Gerard Holt seized on that admission. She's never even flown this plane. This is exactly what Gerard's voice cut through the speaker with the authority of someone who'd guided hundreds of aircraft through emergencies. Sir, whoever you are, shut up now or I'll have the flight attendants restrain you. Hawk, ignore the noise. What's your fuel state? Juliana glanced at Brianna, who checked the information sheet she'd grabbed from the cockpit. 22,000 pounds remaining. Copy. That gives us roughly 2 hours. More than enough for what we need to do. Leonard's voice settled into the calm, methodical tone of someone building a plan in real time. Hawk, I'm pulling up the emergency procedures now. We're going to talk you through this step by step. First priority, get you familiar with the flight deck. You're going into that cockpit. Brianna made a decision that 6 years of airline protocol said was insane and every instinct screamed was necessary. Follow me. They moved toward the cockpit, Juliana, Brianna, and Dr. Isaac Patel, who was staying close to monitor the pilots. Gerard tried to follow, but Ethan blocked his path with surprising firmness. Sir, you need to return to your seat. I have a right to know what's happening. You have a right to sit down and let trained professionals handle this. Choose. The cockpit door opened to reveal a scene that would have sent most people into panic. Captain Douglas Sinclair was slumped in his seat, secured by his harness, his face gray and slick with sweat. First Officer Whitney Carver was worse, having been moved to the jump seat behind the center console. An oxygen mask over her face, Dr. Patel's emergency medical kit opened beside her. Juliana stepped into the confined space and felt 6 years of forced retirement evaporate in an instant.
The Boeing 77 cockpit was nothing like the stripped-down functionality of an F-16, but the fundamentals were universal. Primary flight display showing attitude, altitude, airspeed. Navigation display with their course plotted in magenta. Engine instruments reading normal parameters. The symphony of information that pilots learned to process at a glance. Her hands moved automatically, not touching anything yet, just hovering over controls while her mind cataloged systems. Yoke, throttles, flap lever, landing gear, circuit breaker panels, radio management. Everything was where logic said it should be, overlaid with layers of automation that commercial aircraft used to reduce pilot workload. Anchorage, Hawk is in the cockpit, beginning familiarization. Copy, Hawk. Talk to me. What do you see?
She took the breath, let it out slowly, felt the familiar focus settle over her like armor she'd forgotten she owned. "I'm good," she said. "I know you are. Now, first thing we need to do is wake up Controller Nina Bradshaw. She's my best approach controller, and she's about to become your new best friend. Nina, you with us?" A female voice came through, younger than Leonard's, but carrying the same professional competence. "Copy, Leonard. Hawk, I've got your flight plan pulled up and I'm coordinating with the tower. We're going to bring you into Anchorage International, runway 7 right, 11,000 feet of concrete, plenty of room for a smooth touchdown." "Or a less smooth one," Juliana said dryly, acknowledging the reality that nobody wanted to state explicitly. Nina's response carried a hint of humor that helped cut the tension. "Let's aim for smooth. My paperwork is easier." Behind Juliana, Dr. Patel worked on the incapacitated pilots, monitoring vitals and administering fluids intravenously. The cockpit felt crowded with 3 people standing and 2 unconscious in seats, but there was no choice. The pilots couldn't be moved without risking further complications. "Hawk, I'm ready for the next step." Leonard's voice came back solid and sure. "Copy. Here's what happens next. We're going to walk you through descent procedures, approach configuration, and landing checklist. Step by step. Nina will talk you down final. Between the 2 of us, we've done this dance more times than we can count. Only difference is, usually we're in the tower and the pilot is in front of us. Today we're doing it remote, but the principles don't change. You fly the aircraft. We'll guide you home." Juliana looked through the cockpit windows at the vast blue sky stretching endlessly ahead. Somewhere beyond that blue was Anchorage. Somewhere below was safety. Between here and there was a test that would determine whether legends were made of memory or metal. "Let's bring them home," she said, and for the first time in 6 years, Juliana Mercer felt like herself again. The news traveled faster than the aircraft itself. Within 15 minutes of Leonard Ashford confirming Juliana's identity, the story had reached military channels, airline operation centers, and news desks across 3 continents. Pacific Crown Flight 521, with both pilots incapacitated, being guided by a passenger with military aviation experience, the headlines wrote themselves. But nobody writing them understood the full story yet. At Peterson Space Force Base in Colorado, General Franklin Garrett was reviewing personnel files when his aide interrupted with a tablet showing breaking news coverage. The general's reading glasses slid down his nose as he processed the words on the screen. Then he saw the name, and his expression transformed from confusion to something closer to recognition. "Get me a secure line to Anchorage Approach Control," he said quietly. "Now." At Leonard Ashford's station, the call came through on a priority channel that made him signal Nina to take over the primary communication while he switched frequencies. "Anchorage Approach Control, Director Ashford." "Leonard, this is General Franklin Garrett, United States Air Force. I understand you have Juliana Mercer in the cockpit of Pacific Crown 521. Leonard's response was cautious. Military brass calling about a civilian emergency usually meant complications nobody needed. "Affirmative, General. She's manually flying the aircraft now. So far, performance is exactly what I'd expect from someone with her background." Her background.
Franklin repeated, and there was something in his voice that made Leonard sit up straighter. What do you know about her background, Director? I know she flew F-16s in Afghanistan. I know she saved my life and the lives of 3 other controllers when she took out enemy positions threatening Bagram Air Base in 2018. I know she's one of the finest pilots I've ever had the privilege to work with. Do you know why she's not flying anymore? The question hung in the air for a moment. I was told medical discharge, mental health concerns. Franklin's laugh was bitter. You were told lies. Would you like to hear the truth? On Flight 521, Juliana was working through the descent checklist with Nina's guidance, unaware that 7,000 miles away, her story was finally being told by someone with the rank to make people listen. Franklin Garrett had been her squadron commander in Afghanistan, had written the initial recommendation for the Medal of Honor, and had watched as Colonel Warren Sinclair systematically destroyed the career of the finest pilot Franklin had ever trained. 7 years ago, Franklin said, his voice carrying across the secure channel, Captain Juliana Mercer disobeyed direct orders to maintain altitude during a convoy ambush in the Korangal Valley. She dove into an engagement that could have killed her to save 23 soldiers who were about to be overrun. She took damage, flew a crippled aircraft home on backup systems, saved every single life in that convoy. Jesus, Leonard breathed. I tried to fight it, got overruled by people more interested in protecting the chain of command than protecting the truth. Juliana was forced out, and I've spent the last 7 years trying to find a way to undo the damage. I'm watching the news coverage now, Director Ashford, and I'm seeing an opportunity. What kind of opportunity? The kind where truth gets a second chance. Can you patch me through to the aircraft? Leonard made the connection, and suddenly, Franklin Garrett's voice was filling the cockpit of Flight 521, calm and authoritative, and carrying the weight of unfinished business. Hawk, this is General Franklin Garrett. It's been a long time. Juliana's hands tightened on the yoke for just a moment. She knew that voice, had served under that voice for 3 years, had trusted that voice to have her back until the moment when trust hadn't been enough. General, she said neutrally, I'm watching the news coverage of Flight 521, every major outlet. You're about to become the most famous pilot in the world, Hawk, and I think it's time the world knew the whole story. In the cabin, passengers were glued to their phones, reading updates, watching live coverage, sharing information. Sophie Winters had discovered that the mysterious woman from seat 9F was trending on social media, but the story being told was incomplete. Former military pilot, medical discharge, mental health concerns. Brianna was monitoring the cabin when her phone buzzed with a message from Pacific Crown Airlines Operations. She read it twice, then looked toward the cockpit with an expression somewhere between shock and vindication.
General Franklin Garrett was not a man who did things halfway. Within the next 20 minutes, he would contact the Pentagon Press Office, 3 major news networks, and the Air Force Judge Advocate General's office. He would release the unedited mission footage from Afghanistan, would provide the original Medal of Honor recommendation, would expose every lie Warren Sinclair had constructed. But first, he wanted Juliana to know. 7 years ago, I failed you, Franklin said over the radio, his voice rough with an emotion that military officers weren't supposed to show. I didn't fight hard enough, didn't push back when politics overruled justice. You saved 23 lives and lost everything, and I let it happen. Juliana kept her eyes on the instruments, her voice steady. General, with respect, I need to focus on flying this aircraft. I know, and you're going to land that plane perfectly because that's what you do. But when you walk off that aircraft, you need to know that the truth is waiting for you. Every lie told about you is being corrected right now. Every document falsified is being exposed. Warren Sinclair's career is ending today, Hawk. And yours is being restored. The words should have felt like victory, should have filled the hollow spaces that 6 years of exile had carved into her chest. But Juliana had learned long ago that vindication was complicated when it came too late to change the choices you'd already made. Copy, she said simply.
because there were 273 people depending on her to stay focused, and emotion was a luxury she couldn't afford at 30,000 feet. In Anchorage, media was already converging on the airport. News helicopters were being scrambled, cameras were being positioned. Everyone wanted to witness the moment when a disgraced pilot landed an aircraft she wasn't supposed to be able to fly. On social media, the narrative was shifting in real time. The story of mental health concerns was being replaced by the story of manufactured disgrace. People were sharing the Afghanistan footage, posting testimonials from the soldiers Juliana had saved, digging up Warren Sinclair's history of silencing subordinates who threatened his authority. Sophie Winters watched it unfold on her phone screen, her teenage mind processing the injustice with the kind of clarity that adults often lost somewhere along the way, the compromise and complexity. Someone had done something heroic and been punished for it. Someone had been silenced for 6 years while truth waited for its moment. "Mom," Sophie said quietly, "we're watching history happen." Her mother squeezed her hand, understanding that the history wasn't just about landing an airplane. It was about what happened when someone refused to let lies define them, even when truth took 7 years to catch up. In the cockpit, Nina Bradshaw's voice came through with the next set of instructions. "Hawk, beginning descent in 3 minutes. We're going to bring you down to flight level 250 initially, then step you down as we get closer to Anchorage." Copy. Descent to 250 in 3 minutes. Juliana ran through the mental checklist she'd built over thousands of hours. Descent, approach, configuration, landing. Each phase had procedures, and procedures existed because they worked. She might be improvising the situation, but the fundamentals remained constant. Behind her, Dr. Patel continued monitoring the unconscious pilots. Douglas Sinclair's vitals were stabilizing slightly, suggesting the worst of the acute phase had passed. Whitney Carver was still critical, but holding steady. Neither would be conscious for the landing, which meant everything rested on the woman who'd spent 6 years trying to forget she knew how to do this. General Franklin Garrett's voice came through one last time. "Hawk, one more thing. When you land this aircraft, you're going to have cameras and questions and chaos waiting. You don't have to talk to anyone. You don't owe anyone explanations. But I want you to know, the Air Force owes you, and I'm going to make sure that debt gets paid." "Understood, General. Hawk out." The frequency went silent except for Nina's steady voice providing weather updates and approach information. Juliana adjusted the throttles, feeling the subtle shift as the aircraft began transitioning from cruise to descent phase. 23 soldiers had lived because she'd made a choice. 23 families had gotten their people back. The cost had been her career, her reputation, her identity. But sitting in this cockpit with 273 new lives in her hands, Juliana understood something she hadn't been able to see through 6 years of bitter silence. Some debts took time to collect. Some vindication came not in medals or rank, but in moments where the only thing that mattered was whether you could do what needed doing. The Boeing 777 began its descent toward Anchorage, and Juliana Mercer flew with the steady hands of someone who'd never really stopped being a pilot. She'd just been waiting for the sky to remember her name. Now it had. And she wasn't going to let it forget again.
The descent had been smooth, almost too smooth. Juliana had guided the Boeing 777 down through the initial altitude changes with the kind of precision that made Leonard Ashford's job easier than it had any right to be. She'd followed Nina's vectors, made the power adjustments, kept the aircraft stable through the transition from cruise to approach phase. Then, the weather decided to remind everyone that nature didn't care about human drama or second chances. "Hawk, Anchorage approach. Be advised, weather is deteriorating faster than forecast. Winds now 270 at 28 gusting 42. Visibility dropping to 3 miles in blowing snow. Runway 7 right is still your best option, but it's going to be a challenging approach." Juliana absorbed the information without reaction. 28 knots of wind with gusts to 42 meant crosswind components that would push the limits of the aircraft's capability. 3 miles visibility and snow meant visual references would be minimal until very late in the approach. Challenging was Leonard's polite way of saying this was about to get significantly harder. "Copy weather advisory. Hawk is continuing approach." What Leonard hadn't mentioned yet, what the weather radar was showing with increasing clarity, was that the wind wasn't the only problem. A line of convective activity was developing along their approach path. Not severe, not enough to scrub the landing entirely, but enough to add turbulence and wind shear to an already complicated situation. Nina saw it too. Her voice remained calm, but the instructions came faster now, more precise. Hawk, descend and maintain 15,000. We're going to vector you around the worst of the weather, but you're going to get some moderate turbulence on final approach. Copy, 15,000. The Boeing began to shake. Not dramatically, not the kind of turbulence that sent passengers screaming, but enough to remind everyone that the atmosphere wasn't a solid medium. It was fluid, chaotic, capable of throwing 500,000 pounds of aircraft around like a toy when it wanted to. In the cabin, passengers gripped armrests. Sophie Winters put away her phone and focused on breathing steadily like her mother was teaching her. Gerard Holt had gone very quiet, his earlier objections forgotten in the face of deteriorating weather visible through every window. Brianna made her way through the cabin checking seatbelts, securing loose items, her flight attendant training keeping her movements calm, even as her mind calculated the odds of an inexperienced on-type pilot landing in conditions that would challenge veterans. Then, the first system warning appeared. The master caution light illuminated amber on the panel. Juliana's eyes snapped to the engine indicating and crew alerting system display. A hydraulic system pressure indication was dropping on the number 2 system. Not failed, not critical, just declining slowly enough to be concerning. Anchorage, Hawk. I'm showing hydraulic quantity decreasing on system 2. Still in the green, but trending downward. Leonard's response was immediate. Copy, Hawk. What's your current quantity? 72% and dropping. Rate of decrease suggests we've got maybe 20 minutes before it becomes a problem. The timing was brutal. They were 18 minutes from touchdown, close enough that they couldn't divert to alternate airports without risking running out of hydraulic fluid entirely. Far enough that if the system failed completely, landing would transition from challenging to nearly impossible. Nina made the calculation before Leonard could voice it. Hawk, we're committing to Anchorage. Continuing approach, cleared to 10,000. Once you're established on the localizer, we'll clear you for the ILS approach to runway 7 right. Copy, cleared to 10,000. The turbulence intensified as they descended through 12,000 feet. The aircraft bucked and swayed, fighting gusts that came from angles that seemed to defy meteorology. Juliana's hands moved constantly on the yoke and throttles, making corrections, anticipating the next gust, feeling the aircraft through her fingertips the way she'd been trained to feel it decades ago. Behind her, Dr. Patel braced himself against the bulkhead, trying to keep Whitney Carver stable as the turbulence threatened to dislodge IV lines and monitoring equipment. Douglas Sinclair remained unconscious in the captain's seat, his body held in place by the harness, but his head lolling with each jolt. The hydraulic quantity dropped to 60%, then 55%. The rate was accelerating. Anchorage, Hawk, hydraulic system 2 now at 55%. Estimate total failure in approximately 15 minutes. Leonard's voice remained steady, but everyone listening could hear the calculation being made. 15 minutes was enough time to land. Barely. But if anything else went wrong, if they had to execute a go-around and make a second approach, the hydraulic system wouldn't support it. Hawk, understand. This is going to be a single attempt approach. We're not getting a second try. Copy? 1 attempt.
Flight 521 had run out of options. It was this approach, this runway, this attempt. Everything else was physics and hope, and the question of whether a pilot who hadn't flown this aircraft type before could thread a needle that kept getting smaller with every passing minute. Nina's voice guided them onto the approach path. Hawk, turn left heading 070. That will intercept the localizer for runway 7 right. Descend and maintain 4,000 until established. Left to 070, descend to 4,000. The wind was directly on the nose now, the Boeing fighting through gusts that buffeted and shoved and tried to push them off course. Juliana made continuous corrections, her scan moving between instruments with mechanical efficiency, airspeed, altitude, heading, glide slope indicator waiting to come alive when they reached the intercept point. The hydraulic quantity dropped to 45%. Warning tones began to sound in the cockpit, amber lights joining the master caution in a constellation of systems crying out for attention that nobody could spare right now. Anchorage, Hawk is established on the localizer beginning final approach. Copy, Hawk. Cleared ILS approach runway 7 right. Contact tower on 118.7. Juliana switched frequencies with one hand while the other held the yoke steady through another gust. Anchorage Tower, Pacific Crown 521 Heavy, ILS runway 7 right. A new voice came through.
younger, female, carrying the particular tension of someone watching an emergency unfold on their runway. Pacific Crown 521 Heavy, Anchorage Tower, winds 270 at 31, gusting 45, runway 7 right clear to land, emergency equipment is standing by. The glide slope indicator came alive, showing them slightly above the ideal descent path. Juliana adjusted power, felt the aircraft settle onto the invisible electronic beam that would guide them down to the runway threshold. The turbulence was worse now, wind shear indicators flashing on the panel, the aircraft fighting her for every inch of altitude. 3,000 feet, the clouds were thick around them, gray and churning, offering no visual reference except the instrument panel glowing in front of her face. Everything outside the windscreen was uniform gray, neither sky nor ground visible, just the liminal space between. 2,000 feet. The hydraulic quantity hit 40%. The aircraft's response to control inputs was getting sluggish, the degraded system struggling to move the massive control surfaces against the wind. 1,500 feet. Still in the clouds, still no visibility, just instruments and faith, and Nina's voice providing altitudes and distances that translated into hope measured in decreasing increments. 1,000 feet. The clouds began to thin. Through gaps in the gray, Juliana caught glimpses of white landscape below, snow-covered terrain, approach lights beginning to materialize through the murk. 800 feet. The wind environment came into view. Not clear, not perfect, but visible enough to matter. The centerline lights emerged from the snow like a path through chaos, marking the way home. 500 feet. The wind hit them from the left quarter with enough force to push the Boeing 20 degrees off centerline. Juliana corrected with yoke and rudder, cross-controlled inputs that fought physics and weather and the limitations of degraded systems. 1,500 feet. Hydraulic quantity at 35%. Warnings cascading across the panel. The aircraft wallowing through the air like a wounded bird refusing to accept that flight was becoming optional. 200 feet. She could see the threshold, see the touchdown zone marking, see the emergency vehicles lined up along the taxiway with lights flashing red and white against the snow. 100 feet. Power back, nose high, the Boeings settling toward the runway in slow motion while wind tried to push them left and systems tried to fail and 273 people held their breath. The main wheels touched the concrete at 2:47 p.m. local time. Not smoothly, not gently, but down. On the ground. Hydraulics finally failing completely as the nose wheel made contact and the reversers deployed with a roar that sounded like victory. Juliana kept the nose straight down the center line, standing on the brakes as the Boeing decelerated through patches of snow and ice, emergency vehicles pacing them along the taxiway. When the aircraft finally rolled to a complete stop, when the engines spooled down to idle, when the emergency was officially over, Juliana Mercer sat in the captain's seat and took the first full breath she'd allowed herself in the last 20 minutes. Anchorage Tower, Pacific Crown 521 is down safe. The frequency exploded with voices. Congratulations, relief, questions about status and emergency services and whether the aircraft could taxi. But underneath all of it was something simpler. 273 people were alive, against odds that kept getting worse, against systems that kept failing, against weather that tried to kill them. They were alive because someone remembered how to fly when flying was the only option left.
The cabin erupted. The moment passengers felt the wheels touch solid ground, when the reality registered that they were no longer suspended between sky and earth, but firmly planted on Alaskan concrete, the dam broke. People cheered, cried, hugged strangers, applauded with the kind of raw emotion that comes when you've been forced to confront mortality and live to tell about it. Sophie Winters was sobbing into her mother's shoulder, not from fear, but from something bigger. Relief, mixed with awe, mixed with the understanding that she'd just witnessed something that would define how she saw the world for the rest of her life. Someone had refused to give up when giving up would have been easier. Gerard Holt sat perfectly still in seat 9E, his face drained of color, his hands gripping the armrests so tightly his knuckles had gone white. He'd spent the approach in absolute silence, watching through the window as clouds gave way to snow-covered landscape, as the ground rushed up impossibly fast, as landing seemed simultaneously inevitable and impossible. He didn't join the applause, didn't celebrate, just sat and processed the fact that he'd been wrong, spectacularly, dangerously wrong. The woman he'd tried to prevent from entering the cockpit had just saved his life along with everyone else's. Emergency vehicles surrounded the aircraft within seconds. Fire trucks, ambulances, airport security, the entire emergency response apparatus that Anchorage International maintained for exactly this kind of situation. Even though situations like this weren't supposed to happen. Commercial aircraft didn't land with both pilots unconscious. Passengers weren't supposed to fly Boeing 777s. The statistics said this shouldn't have been survivable. But Juliana Mercer had never paid much attention to statistics. In the cockpit, she methodically shut down systems. Fuel pumps off, hydraulics secured, electrical systems safed. Her hands moved through the shutdown checklist with the same precision she'd used for everything else. Muscle memory taking over while her conscious mind tried to process what had just happened. Dr. Patel was coordinating with the medical teams rushing aboard. Douglas Sinclair and Whitney Carver were being transferred to gurneys, vitals still stable but both requiring immediate hospital care. The cockpit door stood open, and through it, Juliana could hear the chaos of evacuation procedures being initiated. Brianna appeared at her shoulder, tears streaming down her face despite her best efforts at professional composure. "Thank you," she said simply, 2 words that carried the weight of 273 lives. Juliana nodded but didn't respond. Words felt inadequate for what had just transpired. She'd done what needed doing. The gratitude, while appreciated, wasn't why she'd stepped forward. You didn't fly to be thanked. You flew because people needed to get home. "Ma'am," Brianna continued, "there are people waiting to talk to you. Media, airport officials, the airline. Everyone wants—" "I need a minute," Juliana said quietly. Brianna understood. She stepped back, giving the woman who'd just performed a miracle the space to be human for a moment, to let the adrenaline drain, to acknowledge that hands only shake after the crisis ends, not during. Outside, the media circus was already in full chaos. News helicopters circled overhead despite the weather. Camera crews had set up positions along the terminal, telephoto lenses aimed at the aircraft sitting on the runway, surrounded by emergency vehicles. The live coverage had been running for the last 20 minutes, breathless anchors describing the approach, the landing, the impossible made possible by a passenger nobody had heard of 2 hours ago. But they were hearing about her now. General Franklin Garrett had kept his promise. The Afghanistan footage was being broadcast on every major network. Helmet camera video from the convoy showing enemy fire, infrared targeting displays from Juliana's F-16 showing her diving into the valley, radio communications where her squadron commander ordered her to maintain altitude, and she responded with 3 words: "Negative. I'm engaging." The footage showed what written reports couldn't capture: the precision of her gunnery, the calculated risk of every pass, the damage her aircraft sustained, and the 23 soldiers who walked away because one pilot had chosen saving lives over following orders. News anchors were also sharing the documents that General Garrett had released. The original Medal of Honor recommendation signed by her squadron commander, flight lead, and the ground force commander whose men she had saved. The psychological evaluation that Warren Sinclair had fabricated, now exposed by metadata showing it had been created after the mission, not before. The testimony from pilots who'd been pressured to change their statements. The narrative was shifting in real time from disgraced pilot lands plane to decorated hero vindicated after 7 years of injustice. Social media exploded with the story. #HawkMercer was trending worldwide. The soldiers she'd saved in Afghanistan were posting their own testimonials, sharing photos, telling their versions of a story that had been buried for too long. Colonel Warren Sinclair's phone was ringing off the hook. His carefully constructed career was collapsing as reporters dug into his history of silencing subordinates, appropriating credit, and using psychological evaluations as weapons against anyone who threatened his authority. By the time Flight 521's passengers were deplaning, Sinclair's military career was effectively over. But Juliana knew none of this yet. She was still in the cockpit, hands resting on the yoke she no longer needed to hold, staring through the windscreen at emergency vehicles and falling snow and the reality of what came next. A knock on the cockpit frame made her turn. A man in an Anchorage Airport Authority uniform stood in the doorway.
his expression somewhere between awe and professional duty. "Miss Mercer? I'm Airport Operations Manager Thomas Kent. There's a crowd waiting for you at the gate. Media, airline officials, and about 200 passengers who want to thank you personally." Juliana stood slowly, her legs unsteady for the first time all day. The adrenaline was finally wearing off, leaving behind the particular exhaustion that comes from doing something your body and mind weren't sure was possible. "Can I use the jetway?" she asked. Thomas looked confused by the question. "Ma'am, you just landed a commercial aircraft with no type rating, both pilots unconscious, degraded systems, and weather below minimums. You can use whatever you want." She almost smiled at that. Almost. The walk from cockpit to cabin door felt longer than the entire flight. Passengers were still gathering their belongings, but every conversation stopped when Juliana appeared. For a moment, the cabin was silent. Then someone started clapping. Then someone else joined. Within seconds, the entire aircraft was on its feet, applauding the woman in faded jeans and a gray sweatshirt who'd reminded them all that heroes don't always look like the recruiting posters. Sophie Winters pushed through the crowd with the kind of fearless determination that only teenagers possess. She stopped directly in front of Juliana, her eyes red from crying, but bright with something that looked like purpose. "I'm going to be a pilot," Sophie said, not asking for advice, not seeking approval, just stating a fact that had crystallized somewhere between panic and gratitude. Juliana looked at this young woman who'd watched everything unfold and seen possibility instead of fear. "Then be the kind of pilot who saves lives," she said quietly. "The kind who chooses people over protocol when the moment demands it. The kind who remembers that flying is about bringing people home safely, not about medals or rank or recognition." Sophie nodded, committing every word to memory. Gerard Holt was waiting near the exit, and when Juliana passed him, he did something that probably cost him more than the price of his ticket. He met her eyes and said, "I was wrong. I'm sorry." Juliana paused. The apology mattered less than the fact that he'd been willing to give it. "You were scared. Fear makes people say things they don't mean. You're alive. That's what matters." The jetway stretched ahead, and at the end of it waited the world that had forgotten her 7 years ago. The media that wanted her story, the airline that would have questions, the military that suddenly remembered she existed. The truth that had finally caught up with lies told by people who thought power meant never being accountable. Brianna walked beside her, and just before they reached the terminal, the flight attendant asked the question that mattered most. "What happens now?" Juliana took a breath, looked back at the Boeing 777 sitting on the runway, this machine that had carried them through impossible circumstances and demanded nothing but skill and determination in return. There looked forward at the terminal where her life was about to change again, whether she wanted it to or not. "Now," she said, "I figure out who I want to be when people are watching." The terminal doors opened, camera lights blazed, questions erupted from a dozen directions at once, but Juliana Mercer walked through the chaos with the same calm she'd carried into the cockpit, into Afghanistan, into every moment where the world demanded more than people thought possible. She'd been invisible for 6 years. That was over now. The only question was whether vindication would be enough, or if she'd discovered that some things, once broken, could never be fully repaired. The answer was waiting somewhere in the noise and lights and questions. She just had to be brave enough to find it.
The press conference happened 3 hours later in a terminal conference room that hadn't been designed for the number of cameras and reporters crammed into every available space. Juliana sat at a table, flanked by Pacific Crown Airlines executives, FAA officials, and General Franklin Garrett, who'd flown to Anchorage on a military transport the moment Flight 521 touched down. She'd refused makeup, refused a change of clothes, refused every attempt to package her story into something more palatable for public consumption. She sat in her faded jeans and gray sweatshirt, looking exactly like what she was, a woman who'd done a job that needed doing and wanted to go home. The questions came rapid fire. How did it feel to save 273 lives? Was she nervous? Would she fly commercially again? Had she always known she'd return to aviation?
Each question seemed to miss the point entirely, turning survival into entertainment and necessity into heroism. Finally, a reporter from the back of the room asked the question that mattered. Ms. Mercer, the Air Force is offering you full reinstatement at your previous rank with all back pay and benefits. They're offering you any assignment you want, including command positions. What do you say to that? The room went silent. Every camera focused on Juliana's face, waiting for the moment of triumphant acceptance, the return of the hero, the vindication complete. Juliana looked at General Garrett, who nodded slightly. They'd discussed this privately an hour ago. He knew what was coming, even if nobody else did. I appreciate the offer, Juliana said carefully, her voice carrying clearly through the packed room. I appreciate General Garrett's efforts to expose the truth and restore my record. The Air Force acknowledging its mistakes matters more than most people understand. She paused, choosing her words with the precision of someone who understood that what she said next would define how people remembered this story. But I'm declining the reinstatement. The room erupted. Reporters shouted questions over each other. Camera operators scrambled for better angles. The Pacific Crown executives looked at each other in confusion. This wasn't how these stories were supposed to end. Juliana waited for the noise to subside before continuing. 7 years ago, I made a choice. I chose my family over my career. I chose my brother's medical care and my niece's education over fighting to clear my name. Those weren't sacrifices. Those were investments in the people I love, and I have no regrets about them. She glanced at General Garrett, who was watching her with an expression that might have been pride. Getting my record corrected matters. Having the truth known matters. But going back to military service, that's not who I need to be anymore. Then what will you do? Someone called out. Juliana took a breath. This was the part she hadn't been entirely certain about until she'd walked off Flight 521 and seen Sophie Winters declare her intention to become a pilot. Until she realized that vindication wasn't the same as purpose. I'm going to teach, she said simply. Flight instruction. Specifically for people who don't fit the traditional mold. People from backgrounds that aviation often overlooks. Women, minorities, individuals from low-income families who've been told that flying is for other people. The announcement landed like a bomb in the press room. This wasn't the narrative anyone had expected. War hero returns to glory. Disgraced pilot reclaims position. Those were the stories that made headlines. Choosing to teach instead of lead didn't fit the template. But General Garrett understood perfectly. He leaned toward his microphone. For the record, Captain Mercer is making a choice that will have more long-term impact than any command position could provide. She's not running from recognition, she's running toward purpose. There's a difference. A reporter from Aviation Weekly raised her hand and asked, Ms. Mercer, Sophie Winters, the 16-year-old passenger from Flight 521, has already posted on social media that she wants you to be her flight instructor. Will you accept her as a student? Juliana allowed herself a small smile. If Sophie wants to learn to fly, and if her parents approve, I'd be honored to teach her. She's got the right instincts. She just needs someone to help her develop the skills to match. The questions continued for another 20 minutes, but the story was already written. Not the story the media had expected, but perhaps the one that mattered more. Someone had been given everything back and chosen to use it differently than anyone anticipated. After the press conference, Juliana found a quiet corner of the terminal away from the chaos. Her phone had been buzzing constantly, but she'd ignored most of it. Now she scrolled through messages, looking for the ones that mattered.
Her brother had texted, "Saw the news. You're still the most stubborn person I know. I'm proud of you. Also, you're paying for dinner when you get home." Her niece, now a junior in college studying aerospace engineering, had sent a longer message. "Aunt Jules, I just watched you do the impossible and then turn down everything most people would kill for. You've been telling me my whole life that choices define character. Now I understand what you meant. I love you. Also, when can I start flight lessons?" There was a message from Leonard Ashford. "Hawk, it was an honor working with you again. You haven't lost a step. If you ever need anything, you know where to find me." And one from Nina Bradshaw. Best approach control I've ever done. You made my job easy. Also, I'm buying you a drink when you come through Anchorage again. You don't get to say no. Juliana was composing a response when a familiar voice spoke from behind her. You really turned them down. She looked up to find General Franklin Garrett standing there, 2 cups of truly terrible airport coffee in his hands. He offered her one, and she accepted it with a nod of thanks. I turned down the job, Juliana corrected, not the vindication. There's a difference. Franklin sat down beside her with a heavy sigh of someone who'd been awake for 20 hours straight. You could have commanded a squadron, could have shaped policy, could have influenced the next generation of military pilots at the highest levels. Or I could teach kids like Sophie Winters how to trust themselves in the sky, could work with students that the big flight schools overlook because they don't have the right background or connections, could prove that flying isn't reserved for people who look a certain way or come from certain places. Juliana sipped the coffee, made a face, then continued. Which one changes more lives, General? Franklin was quiet for a long moment. Then he smiled, the expression transforming his usually stern military bearing into something warmer. 7 years ago, I failed to protect you from a political witch hunt. Today, you taught me that sometimes the best revenge isn't getting your old life back. It's building a better one. It's not revenge, Juliana said. It's evolution. I'm not the same person I was 7 years ago. Going back would mean pretending those years didn't change me. Teaching means using those changes to make something new. They sat in companionable silence for a while, watching travelers rush past, each person with their own story, their own destination, their own reasons for defying gravity and trusting machines to carry them safely through the sky. Finally, Franklin spoke again. Warren Sinclair has been relieved of duty. There will be a full investigation. Other people he silenced are coming forward now. Your case opened a door that's not closing again. Juliana nodded. The news should have felt like victory, but it mostly just felt like closure. Sinclair's downfall wouldn't undo 7 years, wouldn't change the choices she'd made or the price her family had paid, but it might prevent the next pilot from having to choose between truth and survival. Good, she said simply. He shouldn't be able to do to anyone else what he did to me. He won't. Franklin stood, his coffee barely touched. But Juliana, thank you. Not for today, but for reminding me why we wear these uniforms in the first place. It's not about rank or recognition. It's about service. You never forgot that, even when the service looked different than anyone expected. After he left, Juliana sat alone with her terrible coffee and her buzzing phone and the weight of choices that would reshape her future. Tomorrow she'd fly home commercial, just another passenger. She'd return to her studio apartment and her part-time jobs and start figuring out how to build a flight instruction business from nothing. But she wouldn't be invisible anymore, wouldn't be forgotten. The sky remembered her name now, and she'd make sure it remembered the names of every student she taught. Every Sophie Winters who dreamed of flying but needed someone to show them it was possible. Some people measure success in promotions and medals. Others measure success in lives changed, doors opened, possibilities created where none existed before. Juliana Mercer had learned the hard way which measurement mattered more, and she wasn't going to forget again.
6 months later, the small flight school on the outskirts of Tacoma looked nothing like the gleaming facilities that dominated commercial aviation training. The building was a converted hangar, its metal siding weathered by Pacific Northwest rain, its sign hand-painted with simple letters, Mercer Aviation, where everyone belongs in the sky. Inside, the walls were covered with photos, not of expensive aircraft or celebrity endorsements, but of students. First solos, first cross-country flights, check ride passes. Each photo showed someone who'd been told, in ways both subtle and explicit, that flying wasn't for them. Too poor, wrong background, didn't fit the mold. Juliana had made it her mission to prove those assessments wrong, one student at a time.
Sophie Winters was there 3 afternoons a week after school, working toward her private pilot certificate with the kind of focused determination that reminded Juliana of herself at that age. The teenager had become something of a media phenomenon after Flight 521, doing interviews about her decision to become a pilot, starting a social media campaign encouraging other young women to consider aviation careers. But on training days, the cameras stayed away. In the cockpit, it was just instructor and student, sky and challenge, the ancient dance of learning to defy gravity with skill instead of hope. Trim for level flight, Juliana said calmly, watching Sophie's hands move across the controls of the Cessna 172. Feel how the aircraft wants to climb? Small adjustment. Let it tell you what it needs. Sophie made the correction, her touch gradually developing the light precision that separated adequate pilots from excellent ones. "How did you know?" she asked. "That day on Flight 521, how did you know you could do it when you hadn't flown that aircraft before?" Juliana considered the question. She'd been asked variations of it hundreds of times in the months since the emergency landing. Media wanted dramatic answers. Fellow pilots wanted technical explanations. But Sophie was asking something deeper. "I didn't know," Juliana admitted. "Not for certain. But I knew that giving up guaranteed failure. Trying gave us a chance. Sometimes that's all you get, a chance. What you do with it defines everything that follows." Sophie nodded, filing the answer away with all the other lessons she was learning about flying that had nothing to do with aerodynamics or regulations. The flight school had started small. Just Juliana, one aircraft, and a handful of students who'd heard about her story and wanted to learn from the pilot who'd saved Flight 521. But word spread. Donations arrived from unexpected sources. Veterans organizations contributed funds. The soldiers Juliana had saved in Afghanistan 7 years ago pooled money to sponsor scholarships. Leonard Ashford and Nina Bradshaw sent a check with a note that read simply, "For the next generation of pilots who'll do the impossible." Within 3 months, Mercer Aviation had 3 aircraft and a waiting list. Within 6 months, Juliana had hired 2 additional instructors, both women from non-traditional backgrounds who understood what it meant to fight for a place in a field that didn't always welcome you. The students were exactly who Juliana had envisioned. Marcus, a former mechanic from a low-income neighborhood who had always dreamed of flying but couldn't afford traditional flight schools. Jennifer, a single mother working 2 jobs who did ground school online at midnight after her kids went to bed. David, who'd been told his mild dyslexia would prevent him from getting a pilot certificate until Juliana showed him different learning techniques that worked with his brain instead of against it. Each one had a story. Each one had been overlooked or dismissed or told that flying was for other people. Juliana made it her mission to prove that assessment wrong, not with inspirational speeches, but with patient instruction and unwavering belief that competence could be built from determination. On a Tuesday afternoon, an unexpected visitor arrived. Gerard Holt walked into the hangar wearing jeans and a humble expression that suggested 6 months of reflection had changed more than just his wardrobe. "Ms. Mercer," he said when Juliana finished a lesson and stepped out of the Cessna, "I hope I'm not interrupting." Juliana recognized him immediately, though he looked different without the expensive suit and entitled demeanor. "Mr. Holt, what brings you to Tacoma?" Gerard pulled an envelope from his jacket. "I wanted to give this to you in person. It's a scholarship fund. $50,000, renewable annually, for students who can't afford traditional training. He paused, choosing words carefully. "It's my way of apologizing for being the kind of person who almost prevented you from saving my life." Juliana took the envelope, surprised, but not showing it. "You don't owe me anything, Mr. Holt."
The scholarship became one of many. Pacific Crown Airlines established a fund in Juliana's name. General Franklin Garrett created a military transition program that helped veterans like Juliana find second careers in aviation. Even Nina Bradshaw started a mentorship initiative connecting air traffic controllers with student pilots. But the most unexpected support came from Warren Sinclair. The letter arrived 8 months after Flight 521, forwarded through multiple channels before reaching Juliana's small office at the flight school. The handwriting was precise, almost military in its discipline. Captain Mercer, I do not expect forgiveness. I do not deserve it. What I did to you 7 years ago was wrong. Not just professionally wrong, but morally wrong. I destroyed your career because your competence made my inadequacy visible. I used power to silence truth, because truth threatened my position. I have been relieved of duty. My career is over. These are consequences I earned. But consequences don't undo the damage I caused. They don't restore the years you lost or the opportunities you were denied. I am writing not to seek absolution, but to tell you that I have established a trust fund. The details are enclosed. It will provide scholarships for aviation students from underrepresented backgrounds. It will be administered by a board that includes General Garrett and several of the soldiers you saved in Afghanistan. It will operate in perpetuity. I cannot undo my mistakes, but I can try to ensure that my legacy is something other than the destruction I caused. Your work at Mercer Aviation showed me what redemption might look like, not erasing the past, but building a future that outweighs it. You have no obligation to acknowledge this letter or the fund. I wanted you to know that the pilot you were and the teacher you have become changed how I understand what it means to serve with honor. Warren Sinclair. Juliana read the letter twice, then filed it away. Sinclair was right about one thing. Consequences didn't undo damage, but they could prevent future harm. The scholarship fund would help students who might otherwise never touch the sky. That mattered more than Sinclair's guilt or her resentment. 1 year after Flight 521, Sophie Winters passed her private pilot check ride. Juliana stood on the ramp watching her former student taxi in, seeing the same joy she'd felt after her own first solo decades earlier. Sophie shut down the engine, climbed out of the cockpit, and hugged Juliana with the enthusiasm of someone who had achieved something she'd once thought impossible. "I did it," Sophie said, tears streaming down her face. "I actually did it." "You did," Juliana confirmed. "You trusted the training. Trusted yourself. Now you get to decide what kind of pilot you want to be." Sophie pulled back, her expression serious. "I want to be like you. I want to fly so that when someone needs help, I can answer." Juliana smiled. "Then you're already on the right path. Just remember, being a pilot isn't about the heroic moments. It's about the 1,000 small choices you make when nobody's watching. Choose well, fly safe, and bring everyone home." As Sophie celebrated with her family, Juliana stood alone for a moment, watching the sun set behind the Olympic Mountains. She thought about the woman she'd been 7 years ago, certain that losing her wings meant losing herself. She thought about the woman she'd become during 6 years of invisibility, learning that identity wasn't about what you did, but who you chose to be when stripped of everything you thought defined you. She thought about Flight 521 and the moment when history demanded she remember who she was. And she thought about the future filled with students like Sophie, who deserved someone to show them that the sky belonged to anyone brave enough to reach for it. Some stories end with justice served. Others end with recognition restored. But the best stories end with transformation, with understanding that redemption isn't about reclaiming what was lost, but building something better from the pieces that remain. Juliana Mercer had lost her wings once, but she'd grown them back stronger, wider, and designed not just to carry her through the sky, but to lift others along the way. The legend of Hawk had been written in fire and vindication, but the legacy of Juliana Mercer would be written in the logbooks of every student she taught, every pilot she inspired, every person she showed that belonging in the sky wasn't about where you came from. It was about having the courage to fly when the world said you couldn't. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.
And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.